So I actually am going to move on to our next presentation because our second speaker is Carrie Passaglia. She's our Senior Administrative Director for Clinical Research at the Lurie Cancer Center. And Carrie has over 20 years experience in clinical research and has been leading our Cancer Center clinical trial program for the last 6 years. She is responsible for the overall facility operations and coordinator of clinical research activities among varied departments and institutions. And if you know, if you've had any involvement with the clinical trials program here, you know that it takes a lot of navigation, and we get a lot of questions about clinical trials, especially in our own academic environment. So Carrie is going to be joined today by her colleague, Kristen Hanauer. She's a clinical research nurse with Lurie. And Kristen has over 10 years of experience in clinical research, and in her role as a research nurse, which many of you may have research nurses that work with your team, Kristen actually helps walk patients through the logistics of participating in a clinical trial. And this includes all the process all the way from screening to enrollment through the entire participation lifespan of the trial. So Kristen's here to answer any questions you might have of clinical trials. So we welcome Carrie and Kristen to talk to us about this important topic.
Great, thanks Diane. And we're really excited to be here to share some of our experience and thoughts and do a quick introduction to clinical trials and clinical research. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen quick. Okay, so our clinical trials office is here to help support our Lurie Cancer Center mission of accelerating translation and groundbreaking discoveries, and really looking to provide state-of-the-art cancer care and eliminate disparities. We are an NCI designated comprehensive cancer center and one of 51 across the states. And what that means really is that, we have met some rigorous standards for the depth and breadth of our research here, and that we have ready access to clinical trials for our patients. So normally when patients come in for cancer treatment, we talk a lot about interventional clinical trials. And so what is an interventional clinical trial? It really is a trial where participants receive specific interventions according to the research plan, or what we call a protocol, that's created by our investigators or sponsors that are overseeing that study. And these interventions can help, and they may be medical products such as drugs or devices, procedures, or changes to participants' behaviors such as diets. You might hear, the term translational research thrown around out there also, and that really is sort of an umbrella term for all stages of research, between bench and taking the information that we learn from our basic scientists in the bench, going into preclinical research that then eventually, gets translated into clinical trials that we have participants and patients on. And hopefully at some point, the drugs or devices that we're studying get approved by the FDA to be used in the general public. So why do we conduct a clinical trial? And really, in general, clinical trials are conducted to add medical knowledge about related treatments and diagnosis, prevention of diseases or conditions. We're looking to evaluate different types of interventions, whether they be medication or devices, surgical techniques, radiation therapy, in treating a disease, syndrome, or condition. We're looking to find ways to prevent the development or recurrence of condition, and that can be with medicines or vaccines or lifestyle changes. Looking to examine different methods for identifying conditions in screening and prevention, and exploring ways to improve the comfort and quality of life for patients that have chronic conditions. So clinical trials are research studies that are systematically designed that involve human subjects, and we're looking to assess treatments, therapies, whether they're drug or devices, and vaccines. Clinical research is sort of a general, more broader term where we're looking at patient-oriented research. It can be epidemiological studies or behavioral studies. We can also look at outcomes and health services research, and really, in short, any research that involves people and their associated data is considered clinical research. So just to give you all an idea of the global scope and reach of clinical trials and clinical research, trials are occurring all over the world. There are over 340,000 trials across 216 countries, and only 31% occur in the US alone. So typically when we're doing a trial, it's a global study that's being done with pharmaceutical companies across the world. There's a significant financial cost and investment in clinical trials and drug development. Typically, it costs about $2.6 billion to bring a drug out to the market. When we think about factoring in the bench science and then having to perform these clinical trials, again, not just here, but globally. And then once we do have an approval, the implementation and training, because a lot of these trials get run at centers like ours that are, academic centers, medical centers, bigger institutions. And once those drugs get approved, we have to train and teach other physicians, maybe in private practice or community hospitals, about the drug or device and how to use them and what the different, side effects that they should be looking out for. And so it really is, a big undertaking that costs a lot of money to get a drug approved or a device approved for use. There are over 2.3 million research participants in clinical trials at any given time, and they participate in studies of all levels or phases. So phase 1 studies all the way to phase 4 trials. So when you're going to participate in a trial and you hear about these different phases, this is just a little bit of background of what the phases of clinical trials are. So we have early phase 1 trials, or formerly known as phase 0 trials, where we're really looking to examine safety. And these are where we're testing microdoses, really small doses of, can patients tolerate, what we've seen that maybe some animals have been able to tolerate in the lab in those protocols that we've done. Once we see that they're able to tolerate the microdoses, we move then to phase 1 trials, which are still small in the number of participants that have in it, because we're really looking to see, okay, what's the maximum tolerated dose that we can give now without having patients have risks or side effects that are too great for us to continue on with. And so once we look at that and we're looking at safety, so we'll probably only add a small number of patients on if we see that they have, gotten through the first cycle of treatment without serious adverse events. Maybe then we'll escalate the dose, and we keep going until we have participants that have different risks associated or adverse events. Then we take it back and say, okay, that dose was too high. We're going to stay at this maybe lower dose. Once we find that dose and look at the safety of the profile of the drug or device, then we move on to phase 2 studies. And this is where we're continuing to gather information about safety, but now we're also starting to look at efficacy. So is the drug or device actually working in the manner that we're thinking that it will? And once we start gathering information and seeing that, yes, it does show to have some benefits in treating the condition or disease, then they move on to phase 3 studies. And these are really large population studies where now we maybe have thousands of patients. And not only are we still looking at safety and efficacy, but now we're comparing it to what we have for standard of care. So is it as effective as the standard of care drugs or devices that we're using right now? Or is it, as effective, but maybe has less side effects or risks associated with it? So it's definitely something that we potentially want to continue to approve. There is a phase 4, and typically we can continue to gather data once the actual drug or device is approved for marketing and use. And this is important because we want to maybe look at very long-term side effects in order to know, after a patient has been taking this drug for years, is there any sort of additional adverse event data that we need to collect and consider? And as you can see, drug development takes typically many, many years, because you're doing years of bench science research. And then it takes, years to get all of these products through all of these phases of clinical trials. So there are different types of clinical research that you can consider participating in and that we have to offer. And so when we think of types of research, there's treatment research that involve interventions like medications, devices, biologics, surgery, radiation therapy. Prevention studies where we're looking for better ways to prevent disorders from developing or returning. Diagnostic research, so looking at better ways to identify a diagnosis. Screening, where we're looking at best ways to detect disorders or conditions. Quality of life research, where we're looking to improve comfort or quality of life for individuals with chronic illnesses. Genetic AIMS studies, so we're looking really to do prediction of disorders by identifying and understanding how genes play a role in the illness and how they can be related. And then epidemiologic studies, where we're looking to identify patterns, causes, and control for disorders in a group of people. So aside from those different types, we also have different kinds of sponsors that run these trials. And so at the Cancer Center, we've got industry sponsored studies, and these studies are really trials that are run by pharmaceutical companies, so BMS and Merck that you're probably familiar with. We also do NCI studies that are run through the National Clinical Trials Network. And so we work with cooperative groups that have come up with different protocols and studies that we look at. Investigator-initiated studies are studies that are developed by investigators here at Northwestern. And so your doctors or physician faculty members come up with a concept, and they're the ones that apply with the FDA to actually run the entire trial. And then we've got external investigator-initiated trials where maybe we're participating in a study that was thought up at a different institution, and we're going to be an affiliate site for them. As far as all the people that you interact with when you're participating in a clinical trial, with your care team, there's a lot of different positions that everybody plays. And so our principal investigators, you'll hear that term used a lot when you're looking up information about clinical trials, is the attending physician that's really the responsible leader of the team and ultimately responsible for the conduct of research at our sites. They can then also ask sub-investigators or fellow attendings to participate on the trial. We can have advanced practice providers as sub-investigators. And these are people that really are, licensed and have the appropriate training and education to be able to perform, physical exams and be able to look at labs and assess different adverse events or side effects that patients are experiencing throughout the trials. Our infusion nurses obviously then are trained on giving the chemotherapy or the oral medication. You'll interact with clinical research coordinators or clinical research nurses that are really important in implementing the protocol, gathering the data that's important to, make sure that we're submitting in a timely manner to help keep participants safe so we can see our patients experiencing the same side effects across all the different sites that are participating on this study. And then regulatory coordinators and teams that are responsible for the regulatory submission and to our oversight bodies like our Institutional Review Board and the FDA. So all of these people work together along with the trial sponsor and the FDA to really be a checks and balances system to make sure that we are conducting the clinical trials appropriately, that we're monitoring them. Our institutional review boards are very much concerned with making sure that the rights and welfare of our participants are looked after. They review and approve all the studies that we open here at Northwestern and review them at least once a year. The FDA oversees how the sponsor and our investigators and our review board are making sure that we're running the trials appropriately and monitoring them appropriately for safety of participants. So what should you think about before joining a clinical trial? You really want to make sure that you understand, what happens during a clinical trial, the type of healthcare you will receive, any related costs once you're enrolled in the trial, and then the benefits and risks associated with participating in a clinical trial. And, participation in a clinical trial is something that you really want to do your homework on and research on, because there's a lot of questions that you should come and consider when you want to look at trial participation. So some people participate in clinical trials because none of the standard approved treatment options have worked, so they're unable to tolerate certain side effects. Clinical trials can provide another option when standard therapy has failed. Others participate in clinical trials because they really want to contribute to the advancement of medical knowledge. And all clinical trials have guidelines called eligibility criteria about who can participate. The criteria are based on factors like age and sex and type of stage and stage of disease, previous treatment history, other medical conditions. And this really helps reduce the variation within the study and to make sure that the researchers will be able to answer the questions that they plan for the study. So not everyone who actually wants to participate in a trial ends up being eligible. And so we have to go through the screening process. But a trial is really like an additional tool in the toolbox that our physicians have. And I think, Kristen, from your experience, I think that that's something that a lot of the patients and participants sort of bring up and ask.
Yes, I love the metaphor of the tool in the toolbox, because our physicians explain it as you are presented a clinical trial at a certain point, and Carrie talked about the different phases of clinical trials. So let's say you establish care with a physician at Northwestern and they present a clinical trial that is for treatment naive patients or a second line therapy. So patients that have never had any cancer treatment before qualify, as well as those who have only had one line of therapy previously. So it's important to know that when trials are presented, that patient, or you only qualify for that specific trial at that point in time. But it's not something that, you know, you need to necessarily rush into. It's just another option. And like I said, a tool in the toolbox, because a clinical trial gives you an additional tool, whereas the standard of care therapies, there's only so many options, and cancer is smart. So a lot of our physicians and physicians everywhere only have a set number of therapies they can try to treat the cancer. So one by one, as a treatment stops working, or the patient has side effects that cause that patient to come off that treatment, they move down the line to other treatments. So clinical trials are just additional options for patients to consider.
Great. And one of the key points and factors in considering clinical trial participation and asking all these questions is through the process of informed consent. And informed consent is really that process of information exchange that begins from the time you find recruitment materials, somebody calls you about pre-screening, if you're bringing in any information that you're going to ask your provider about. It's sort of where we start talking and walking through, what does participation in a clinical trial mean? And so when you're presented with informed consent, they will always have these sections, and you'll be walked through what the purpose of the research is going to be. There should always be a description of the risks and benefits in the informed consent. We talk about alternative procedures or courses of treatments. There's always a statement of confidentiality and who's going to have access when you participate in a clinical trial to your personal health information. It walks through the explanation of the treatment. So what does the treatment look like? How many cycles? How long are you going to be expected to participate? Who to contact if you've got questions about the clinical trial. A statement that, you know, participating in the clinical trial is always voluntary, and then information about the trial being added on clinicaltrials.gov, which is a website where all intervention treatment trials have to be listed. It'll tell you who the PIs are at all the different sites, give you some general information about eligibility criteria, and then they have to report any outcomes on those clinical trials on that site. So it's also a really good resource. When we talk about the informed consent process, you know, as a patient, you should always have an appropriate place, a quiet space for this discussion. You should have enough time, and your providers and the clinical research team will make sure that we allot enough time to go over the entire consent, talk about the objectives of the trial, and allow time for you to have your questions, you know, answered. And I think with this, a lot of the times, like Kristen mentioned, you don't want to feel rushed. And so Kristen, in your experience with this, I think you mentioned that a lot of patients feel comfortable taking the informed consent home and talking to their family about it.
Yeah, so everyone's different, and some patients hear a clinical trial be offered and they want to sign consent and they're ready to start, you know, yesterday. And then there's a lot of people who want to think about it because, again, participating in a clinical trial is an agreement as well. So there are things that we as the researchers need from you as the patient, and that is to be, you know, compliant with those visits that are scheduled. And sometimes, many times, clinical trials do require additional visits, like the period called the screening period. So to make sure that the patient is eligible and able to enroll, there are additional tests or procedures that we need to conduct. And we do not, as a research staff, we don't want to rush anyone. That's never our intention. And I like to be in on new patient visits with the providers and listen to what the physician is guiding the patient with, meaning urgency wise. Is your cancer the type of cancer that we need to move very quickly on? Or do we have a little bit of time to figure things out and you can go and get other opinions? But I like to echo the physician and encourage the patient to always take time when it comes to making that decision, when it comes to the research. And at that point, even if it is a cancer that we have to move very quickly on, I encourage the patient to take the informed consent home. I also send a virtual copy so it can be sent to their primary care provider, family members, and they can think through it and then come up with those appropriate questions, because these consent forms can be 20 or 30 pages long. and you won't have all the questions at that time when you're just introduced to the trial. And what is nice about being at a comprehensive cancer center is that you already have your clinical team. And then when you become a potential patient for a clinical trial, perhaps you're interested in it, you become part of the research staff's, you're on the research staff's radar. So in a way, a silver lining of participating in a clinical trial is that you get concierge medicine at times. So even if you participate in a trial and let's say you get a standard of care arm of therapy and you're really bummed out about it, you wanted that investigational agent, there's still added attention to you in a way where, you know, you have me working to get your appointment and your scans and your labs and your EKG all on the same day. So I'm essentially your research nurse and your navigator, if you will. But we do want participants to be comfortable with just the decision in participating in research. And it can be very overwhelming at the time of a diagnosis. And we don't expect you to sign consent that day. And we have an open dialogue through the process.
Absolutely. So as Kristen mentioned, you know, there are a lot of things to consider and a lot of questions that you want to think about asking and writing them down. So, you know, when you think about the study itself, what is the purpose of the study? Why do the researchers think the approach may be effective? Who funds the study? Who has reviewed and approved the study? How long will the study last? What is your responsibilities for taking part in the study? And then who's going to tell me about the results of the study and how will I be informed? Definitely risk and possible benefits. So what are the possible short-term benefits and long-term benefits of participating in the trial? What are short-term risks and side effects? Long-term risks, are there other options available to me besides participating in this clinical trial? And then how do the risks and benefits of the trial compare to those other options that I've been presented? You want to think about, you know, what kinds of therapies, procedures, or tests are you going to have? Are they going to involve extra visits? How do the tests compare to what I would normally have done, and how, you know, the timing of those procedures outside of a clinical trial? Will you be able to take regular medication while taking part in your clinical trial? Sometimes clinical trials prohibit, you know, even certain types of vitamins and supplements. Where will I have my medical care? Is it all going to be done at this location? Can I participate somewhere closer to home? Who's going to be in charge of my care? Is it going to be just the investigator on the study, or can I continue with, you know, my current provider? How will being in the study affect your daily life? How many visits does participating in the trial require? Will I have to be here every single day? Am I going to be here once a month? Can I talk to other people that are involved in the clinical trial? Definitely thinking about cost issues as far as, you know, will I have to pay for any part of the trial, such as the test or the study drug itself? If so, what are the charges going to be? Is this something that my health insurance is going to cover? Who can help answer questions about your insurance company or health plan? Is there going to be any additional travel or childcare costs that you need to consider when participating in a clinical trial? And so there's a lot of questions, again, that you might want to ask. And so when you're talking to your doctor about clinical trials, you may want to consider taking a family member with you or a friend along for support, even just to record, you know, some of the questions that you're asking or the answers and responses. Plan what to ask ahead of time and don't hesitate to ask any questions at all. Write down the questions in advance so that you remember everything. Write down the answers so that they're available when you need to refer back to them. Ask about bringing a tape recorder to make sure that you can, you know, have access to the questions and answers, because sometimes, as Kristen mentioned, these consent forms can be 20 or 30 pages long. There's a lot of information. You might not remember everything that was discussed at that visit, so you want to be able to reference back. How many times am I supposed to come? Am I supposed to fast ahead of time? How often do I need to get scans? All of those questions that you're going to be walked through during the informed consent process. And I know, you know, Kristen has sort of mentioned too, and I'll let her chime in with a little bit about her experience with the types of questions that patients ask.
I would say the most common question I hear is the patient asking the provider, what would you do? And here at Northwestern, being a comprehensive cancer center, I can say that we are biased in our view of clinical research. We want to advance care and we want better options for patients. So if the provider is presenting a clinical trial, again, it doesn't mean that you will be eligible for the trial, but it does mean that that provider believes that it would be a good option. And again, it could be an additional tool where at certain times in your care, you're only going to be, you will only qualify for a trial at that moment, like in phase 2 trials, for example. Phase 1 trials, are a lot more time intensive, and it's important to think about, what you want your life to look like and the time commitment you want to spend. But again, if you are someone who knows that you want to, advance knowledge, but also have an extra tool, research is great. But the physician, if they're presenting this opportunity to you, it doesn't mean you'll be able to participate, but it's just an added line of therapy, if you will. So, and we completely understand if people are not interested, because some people they're not very social, for example, and they don't want to have all these extra people involved in their care, and they just want to come for their treatment or be close to home, and they don't want to answer all the same questions a bunch of times, and they don't want to adjust certain things in their lifestyle just to participate in the trial. And we understand that, but we have to do our due diligence and give everyone the opportunity if we believe that they qualify. So I like the way Dr. Benson explains it to patients, that when he's asked, would you do this? He says, I brought this up because I do think you'd be a good candidate. An example of a trial that he spoke to someone about was you would be randomized to either a standard of care therapy, or you would get the standard of care plus the investigational agent. And a good candidate for a trial knows why the research is being done and is also okay with either arm of the trial. So if he knows that the patient is not interested in participating in research unless they get the arm they want, then, would that person be a good candidate? Maybe not. However, I like to say on the side that research is voluntary. So you could sign consent, and let's say you got that standard of care arm and you have to travel an additional 2 hours to get downtown, and that's just not what you want. It's okay to sign consent, find that out, and withdraw. It's not what we want ever, but at the same time, we want patients to know that they have those opportunities. And, the only way we advance and the only way we know about treatment later on is comparing these therapies. So the silver lining, like I mentioned before, is that even if you get standard of care, you do get, in a sense, concierge medicine, where I'm organizing, or the research team is organizing it for you, and you're really helping us advance our knowledge and hopefully have better care for all later.
Great. So I know we're out of time, and these are sort of references and different resources of where you can go to find information about clinical trials, questions you can ask about participating in clinical trials. There's really great information on the NIH.gov website. It's got patient-facing information on there for you. So thank you all very much. I know there's some questions, I think, in the chat that I'll try to answer really quickly. One of the questions is about being in a clinical trial. Are there databases where oncologists can submit results on their patients, so side effects or medications, survival data, without actually being a trial? So typically there's not like a centralized database where that information goes. We have a lot of this data. I think we use a lot of that data outside of a clinical trial to sometimes do like retrospective chart reviews. And so we can take a look at our patient population after they've gone through treatment and sort of look at some of those things. And eventually, I think, some of the faculty members then use that information to develop and create their own clinical trials here. How and when and by whom is it decided when a clinical study needs to be halted because the side effects are extremely good results of the experimental treatment? So Typically, there are data safety monitoring boards associated with all clinical trials, especially interventional ones. And so they're monitoring all of the side effects data. And so that gets reported then to the FDA. And in conjunction with all of the investigators that are participating on this trial, the data safety monitoring board and the FDA, they're the ones that make the decision on like, hey, we need to stop and look at this. Maybe we need to add additional tests and procedures along the way to try to eliminate some of these risks. We might need to lower the doses. And so it does get reviewed by these monitoring boards and committees before those decisions are made. Okay. Well, thank you all so much. It was a pleasure having this discussion with you all, and hopefully it'll give you some good information and thoughts about clinical trials in the future.
There's one more
Hi, Carrie,
question.
this is Diane. Oh, there is one more question.
Why are there costs to the participant, and what are potential costs to the participant? So for example, the cooperative groups don't have a lot of that funding to pay for all of the therapies that or tests that a patient would already get with that diagnosis. So a lot of those trials do build insurance for standard of care because those tests and procedures would be done regardless of the participation in a clinical trial. And if there's something directly needed for the trial only, then, a lot of times it is covered. And if it's not, it's something that we would find out ahead of time because of course it is a financial burden. And we would address that with either the sponsor or, if insurance doesn't cover it, it could be the limiting factor of whether or not that person participates.
I'm going to ask you one more question just in the spirit of our theme of self-advocacy. Could you just give us a very quick primer or give our participants a quick primer on how they can search for a clinical trial themselves?
Yeah, we've got, you can look for clinical trials on our website, and the list of all of our different clinical trials are located on there, as well as I mentioned, clinicaltrials.gov. It's sort of a clunkier system when you're searching through that system, but that one is going to list all of the clinical trials that are available across all of the different institutions. So that's definitely a good resource if you're looking for what clinical trials are available where.
Thank you both so much. I know this is a topic that people have a lot of questions about, and certainly clinical trials has been in the news a lot more these past couple of years than we've ever heard. So we really appreciate you kind of pulling back the curtain and letting us see all the stuff that happens in order to get clinical trials up and running and enroll your participants. And we thank you guys for staying late because I can see you're both still in your offices and joining us today. So